Support Past Present by becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month. Sign up now at patreon.com/pastpresentpodcast.
Historians will look back and they'll be able to have a better look at mistakes after some time has passed.
History began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake.
But I am a pretty strong believer that the past is behind us and the dead are dead, and this is our world to make.
Welcome to the Past Present Podcast, where we look at American culture and politics today through the lens of history and turn hindsight into foresight. It's June 11th, 2021. On today's show, pride parades across the country are debating whether uniformed gay police officers should be allowed in the parade. We look at the tensions running through this year's pride celebrations. In New York City, I'm Nicole Hemmer, an associate research scholar at Columbia University and columnist for CNN Opinion. Also here in New York, Natalia Melman-Petruzella. Natalia, tell us what you do.
I'm associate professor of history at the New School and working on a book about American fitness culture.
And out in Los Angeles, Neil Young. Neil, what do you do?
I'm a contributing writer for The Week and working on a book about the history of LGBTQ Republicans.
Something that has nothing to do with our topic today, so sure we won't be hearing from you at all. All right, so the New York Pride Parade has had an eventful few years. In 2019, it marks the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, with 5 million revelers packing the streets of New York. In 2020, the parade went online, a concession to the still raging pandemic. And in 2021, the event has been riven by disagreements, most prominently over the presence of uniformed police officers marching in the parade. After tense debate, the parade organizers decided to ban uniformed officers, who had been part of the parade since the 1980s, an effort to address the trauma of police brutality. This is not the only issue dividing Pride attendees. There have been numerous complaints recently about how corporate the parade and Pride Month more generally has become. Neil, why are we seeing these tensions in Pride now?
Well, I think as we've said over and over again on this podcast for the past year, the events of the past year have served in many ways to expose and magnify simmering tensions within various communities and institutions. And so I think that that's just sort of, again, a sort of historical development that we're seeing over and over again right now. But I think we should also think about the particulars of LGBTQ history and how those are playing out in this moment. I would argue that those tensions have been on the more simmering side of things than less so. They've been kind of more apparent, actually, through the years, and an ongoing point of conversation and debate within the community around a lot of the issues that have been magnified more brightly, I think, in other communities. So I'm thinking here about the long history of race and racism within the LGBTQ community that I think is really coming to a head here. And also the very long history of police violence and brutality against LGBTQ persons. And so all of those things I think are converging in this moment, along with a long-standing question of what is this month really about? What is this parade really about? It's important to remember this parade began as a march, as a protest march. And I think one of the questions we can ask is, how do marches become parades? Because I think that has been an ongoing question around this particular event, and certainly for the activists who are most involved.
I think that's such a smart question about how protests become parades, because there's also a reverse process that's going on right now in the Pride community, which is parades becoming protests. And so you're right to highlight both the events of the last year, but also the split around policing was evident 2 years ago during the 50th anniversary celebration, when Reclaim Pride had held a protest march before the big 5 million person parade to protest police brutality, to protest racism, and to protest violence, in particular against trans people of color. And so I think that thread has been being made more visible in recent years, even though it's been there, as you rightly point out, for quite some time.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think also we're really seeing as well the kind of tension in the movement or movements between reformism and revolution in so many ways, right? That on the one hand, let's take this corporate question, which has been in the air for years, wow, Chase Bank is like wrapped in rainbow flags. Like, hooray, that would have been controversial and, you know, a non-starter not so long ago. On the other hand, and that's a great triumph in some ways of the kind of mainstreaming of a certain form of LGBTQ support. On the other hand, like, is that kind of sapping this radical movement and co-opting something which, you know, in some forums would be like very anti-capitalist, anti-Chase Bank. And I think that the police question raises that same tension between revolution and reform, in the sense that a lot of the gay police officers are angry because they're saying, we've been working to make this institution, which marginalized our communities for so long, more humane and more accepting. And we're literally putting our life on the line and giving to it. That's our life's work, like, to be marginalized by the very community that we're helping, that we are working to help not have those conflicts, which were foundational to Pride. Like, I understand that perspective too, but I also understand, particularly in the light, not only of the last year, but also of the centrality and often understood or explored or under highlighted role of people of color in the late 60s and 70s in gay liberation to begin with, particularly in the Stonewall riot. I understand too that they might think that having police there, like, this is an undercutting of its original purpose. And also, even if you think of it as a celebration, this kills the celebratory vibe because of that history and present in a lot of ways too, particularly for people of color. So it's complicated.
Well, and that reform and revolution divide was present at Stonewall in 1969, right? That the Mattachine Society, which had been working very much in this respectability politics frame for, at that point, decades, had placed a sign at the Stonewall Inn that told people to protest peacefully and to not fight with the police. And it was the exact wrong message for that moment, right? They were in a revolutionary moment. And by calling for this kind of peaceable, reformatory spirit, they were seen as standing in the way of gay liberation. Now, a year later, they would be part of the Pride gathering that marked the 1-year anniversary of Stonewall. So they are brought back into the movement. But in that moment, that serves now as kind of the foundational moment of Pride, it was Mattachine that was, calling for something a lot softer than what many of the people there wanted.
Yeah, and I think that all of this is useful for just, to the extent we can in the limited time here, speaking to the broad diversity within this community, within this movement, and the competing tensions that run through it. And I think that sort of like history of respectability politics that you're talking about, Nikki, with the Mattachine Society and the real emphasis on clean-cut appearances and on a sort of assimilationist ethic, right? Like that what most of them wanted was an American society that would just incorporate them and would stop, discriminating and harassing, but wasn't seeking revolution. And that's not what a lot of the trans activists who were at Stonewall, I mean, that's not their goal, their mission. They know that that's not a possibility. And so that sort of, again, that reform revolution tension has been there all along. I think the language of reform, and certainly the sort of discourse or the self-conception that certain persons might be internal agents of reform. So in this example, the history of queer cops and the ways in which they've defended themselves and even thought of themselves as, again, internal agents of reform of this institution. It reminds me a lot of the arguments gay Republicans have made through the decades, right? Like, why are you in this political party that wants to criminalize everything you do, that wants to, deny you all your rights? They've argued over and over again through the decades, well, we are the internal agents of reform here. We're going to change the party from within. What I do think is particularly interesting is that language of reform has dramatically dropped away from gay Republicans in recent years. I think in the Trump years, that sort of reform language just wasn't like an animating discourse among most gay Republicans. But, you'll have to read the book to hear more about that. I don't want to get too far afield here. But to kind of talk about the ways in which this language is used by a lot of different queer actors for a lot of different purposes more broadly.
I want to pick up on that assimilationist language because it was such an important part of the early debates over same-sex marriage and marriage equality. And I feel like it dropped out as marriage equality became this more broad-based goal and as it garnered more popular mainstream support and then, of course, became the law of the land in 2015. But the idea of gay marriage was seen by some activists as assimilationist, as fundamentally conservative. And in some ways, Andrew Sullivan, who was one of the early advocates of same-sex marriage, was making a conservative assimilationist argument and was arguing in those terms very explicitly, which really does drop out of at least the mainstream conversation around marriage equality at a certain point. But those tensions were very, very hot in the mid-1990s as that conversation was unfolding.
That's right. And you can understand, I mean, in some ways, I think, what Sullivan was doing and making a very conservative argument for the expansion of marriage, right? One that's affirming the kind of conservative elements of the institution, like that's just good, shrewd political strategy, right? And also I think you can think, well, let's think about Sullivan's larger politics here. And maybe this isn't only just like shrewd strategical tactics. I do think another kind of interesting component, and this ties back into the questions we're raising about the month of Pride, is does the politics of the movement, or rather, how does the legalization of same-sex marriage change the politics of the movement? Because a big criticism within the community has been that gay white men who have been the sort of public face of gay politics, even if they haven't really been the driving actors, that a lot of their political involvement and energy has dropped away remarkably in the years since the legalization of same-sex marriage. And in a sort of sense of like, we got what we wanted, full equality has been achieved. All right, we're Americans now, end of discussion. Like, and the larger community's ongoing insistence that there are lots of political fights to continue to take up, that is not widely felt, or rather there's a real disagreement about kind of what the political urgencies of the moment are and what they will be.
Yeah, and I think particularly as those other fights are not only not linked to gaining access to as kind of bedrock a conservative institution as marriage, but also are connected to linking up with other very progressive causes, right? Whether it is kind of, defund the police or decolonization in Israel-Palestine, and I think that plus let's not forget the adding of the letters. We're saying LGBTQIA, with all of those letters, you have a more sort of umbrella inclusivity in a way, but you also have a kind of like attention to a diversity of identity, which I think can contribute to some of the splintering that you're talking about beyond just white gay men and everybody else, but among that everybody else too.
I mean, I am curious about that argument. I think it's certainly true that cis white gay men have been the face of the movement. And is that, Natalia's talking about issues sort of outside of sexual identity more broadly, but what about something like the Equality Act? Is it because the cis gay white men who are the face of the movement are also middle and upper class and so less likely to face the kind of employment discrimination that something like the Equality Act is addressing?
Yeah, and I think that's even more true when we look at things like access to healthcare, about housing issues, those sorts of issues that I think a lot of, as you say, white gay men don't have a sort of personal connection to. I think given that a lot of white gay men don't feel connected to those particular issues, it's not surprising that there's been less engagement, less activism around those issues from them. And certainly, white gay men are not the only people that are part of this community. And again, I would say that they have not been the driving actors of the political movement of the last several decades. However, I do think that they have been the public profile, the public face of it, that the media has looked to over and over again. And to that extent that the media helps us frame the sort of urgencies of politics, it's important if they aren't fully invested in those issues.
I'm also curious, and maybe Natalia, you can speak a little bit more about this. It is something that we have seen in movement after movement recently, and I would also say at least in the last 50 years or so, that there aren't really single issue movements anymore. You do have something like climate change activists, right? But who are also deeply invested in issues of policing and issues of Palestinian rights, that there is a tendency toward a kind of globalism when it comes to progressive and left-wing activism. I think this is also true on the right as well. But I'm curious why that is. Do you all have thoughts on that sort of all-encompassing tendency, which seems to be particularly high-pitched right now?
Well, there's this theory called intersectionality you might have heard of.
Say more. Oh, wait, is this critical race theory? Because I think that we might be banned in some states at this point.
Oh, it's all the same. You mean critical racist theory, as I saw on a sign at one school protest yesterday on TV, not when I was actually attending or holding that sign, for the record. But yeah, Nikki, I think that you're right about that increasing sort of umbrella approach to particularly progressive activism. And I do think it has to do with intersectionality theory, which has been around since the late 80s, but which posits, to put it in very sort of basic terms, the idea that one's identity is multi-layered and that one's full kind of presence in engaging with the world is a function of the multiple identities that intersect to create oneself, one's power, and one's positionality. And this came out of legal studies. And, I think that perspective has been very powerful in giving a sort of language and a framework for understanding some of the tensions we've been talking about and some of the divergences of why, this affluent cis white man is gay, and so's this lesbian who is homeless and, I don't know, has a disability. But why don't their interests align, And I think that's a pretty crude example, but I think intersectionality has helped give language to understand those, those divergences, but also almost paradoxically in some way has created this like fanning out of activist movements to be like, well, you can't really be a feminist, because of course the Women's March dealt with some of these very same issues. You can't be a feminist if you're not fighting for women's liberation everywhere. And, if you're a feminist who's fighting for, like, say, Sheryl Sandberg, better ways to climb the corporate ladder, that's actually not feminist, because that's happening on the backs of the women of color who are working in those buildings or taking care of your children or cleaning your houses. And I think that is very helpful in illuminating a lot of not just blind spots, but deliberate blind spots that have really blinkered these movements and made them exclusive. I think on the other hand, that like package deal in a way has made it really hard for some of these activist movements, particularly in a moment when they're meant to be celebratory or to advance policy, to keep it together. Because I think there are, for example, to go back to our original thing that we're talking about here, I'm sure there are people who feel like very excited about going to gay pride, but who might have like very divergent, opinions on the police, right? Not just their presence at the parade, but more broadly. And I think that kind of intersectional perspective can be really helpful in illuminating why those divergences exist, but isn't always that helpful in actually creating spaces for unified action.
Well, I think since you used the word celebratory, I do want to go back to Neil's initial question, which I still find so fascinating, which is this transition from protest to parade. How did that happen?
Well, I think before we can answer how that happened, I think we really need to think about like what are the origins of those protests, because I know like Stonewall stands in as so big here in the sort of popular conception of LGBTQ history, of like gay rights, of even like pride. And yes, Stonewall is obviously important, but I think, a lot of historians have pointed out Stonewall's immediate effects were much more local. And when we look to the other communities where these protests arose, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in DC, they were almost always directly connected to police violence and police brutality in those cities. So, for example, San Francisco, 1972 is their first gay protest march. And in 1972, the organizers of that event directly referenced a 1966 event, which was the Compton's cafeteria riot. Again, a kind of similar scenario to Stonewall, where police went into a cafeteria that was a very popular location for queer persons to gather, and they had been beating them up all summer. And finally, one night, the crowd there fought back. And so that sort of direct connection to an event in a particular city that led to the sort of mass organizing. Again, I just want to point out how these things arose in very specific and very local context. And so if we have that sort of perspective, we can understand the origins here as directly tied to police harassment, police violence, and local circumstances. And I think over time, as these protests continued to play out on an annual basis, they began to link up across the country. And I think in some ways, the linking up across the country, which happens over the course of the 1970s, is part of what transforms it from local protest into something different, into celebration. Or at least into a parade, right? That's doing something different than, again, that protest origin. So I think it's changing over the 70s, certainly in the 80s and 90s. And it's all the more, I think, once corporations get involved and they see this as something that they want to sign on to. I think that really changes the look and feel of these events.
Totally. Well, on look and feel, I think in these protests, like this is rightly not the center of our conversation about the controversies, but, you know, with this corporatization has come a little bit of a sanitization as well.
Yes.
And like, you know, I, every year being, you know, first of all, I live right by Stonewall. I mean, I walk by his Christopher Street like 3 times a day. It's really wild. But, you know, I'm also a parent in the neighborhood, and like Pride is pretty much this non-controversial thing. Kids go out dressed in rainbow outfits. Like it's just this like love one, love all thing. And so one of the controversies that comes up from families and from some other folks too is sort of around like, should like kink and BDSM and like overtly like sexual things be included in Pride? And like some people, to your point earlier, Neil, about like the triumph of a sort of family values sensibility in a certain part of this movement, are like, that's not respectable. That's not appropriate. This is a family event. Now, you know, someone who died in like 1970 and woke up today and would hear like people being like, this is a family event, would be like, what the hell happened in America? But I think it's so interesting, and in some ways like such evidence of the triumph of this movement, that like there are legitimately families who are offended that like this fringe part is offending their sensibilities, because fundamentally Pride is this like wonderful, wholesome event, when that is a sea change in so many ways. Like it was long after Stonewall, like in the late 70s, there were still bills to not let gay people teach in schools because they were seen as recruiting, you know, children to the gay lifestyle. And I don't want to overstate the disappearance of homophobia, because talk about transphobia also. It's still very, very much with us. But this particular debate in Greenwich Village among families wanting to preserve the wholesomeness of Pride like makes me smile.
It definitely speaks to the triumph of one particular vision of what Pride looks like. I want to pull on one other historical thread, and that is the idea of Pride in and of itself and the historical conditions under which that becomes the center of the way this movement is framed, right? Like it has to be understood in the context of the ideas of oppression and shame that had for so long been a barrier for gay men and women to access rights, to access acceptance, and that Pride was about not being ashamed, in addition to being liberated. Now, in 1970, this was called a Gay Liberation March, not a Pride Parade. But that idea of Pride, especially in the late 1960s and early 1970s, is central to liberation movements. That liberation movements weren't just about freedom, but they were also looking internally at a community and putting pride and a kind of celebratoriness at the heart of these movements. And this is true for Black pride and brown pride and for feminism as well, that there was something emotional and sort of self-love is the wrong word, but
self-dignity,
self-determining, or like it's self-determination,
actually,
right?
Yeah, the part of that I would argue with is self, right? That it was more than self, that it was about community pride and dignity and determination.
Collective uplift, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, that's an important thread in all of this as well.
Yeah, I would just tweak that a little bit to say that I don't think the celebratory dimensions were there at the origins. Like, I think that that is a historical development, but I think absolutely with everything else that you're saying, I mean, the sense of pride, and I think we can, what you're doing here is historicizing what pride means over time, right? And so in those origin moments, when gayness, when homosexuality is conceived as illness, as deviance, as criminality, to talk about pride is to articulate a sense of the self that has dignity, that is good. I mean, that was the signs that they carried. Gay is good, right? And that was a direct response to gay as sickness, right? To homosexuality as illness. It's an assertion of the self as self-determined, as dignified, as worthy, and as whole. And I think that is very different from a sort of celebratory impulse of pride is a celebration of like living your best life, or like whatever the kind of discourse of now is. And I think that's kind of really important to see how that changes over time. And certainly, like, in a lot of ways, that's a good thing, right? That's a really great thing. And yet I think a lot of the conversations and the debates that are happening now are saying, well, celebrations for whom and celebrations of what? And not all of us are on this same sort of historical trajectory, or we find ourselves in really different places in this larger historical phenomenon of cultural acceptance that has played out in the last couple of decades, and that has accelerated in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as you're describing that conversation, or that kind of evolution of, the idea that like one has to first satisfy their kind of base levels of survival, which are shelter and food and protection. And then as you kind of go up the hierarchy, eventually it's living your best life and fulfillment. And I think what you point out, Neil, which is really important, is that at the origins of pride, like that living your best life was so far, or I should say the origins of this protest, that living your best life was so far away, because this was a moment when you could not be your full self, be whole, as you put it, without being seen as deviant, mentally deficient, and as a criminal, right? And so you were thus deprived of, of a livelihood, as we know from the whole lavender scare, and of people being fired from their jobs, which came before, but had certain legacies there. And like I mentioned, even after, with gay teachers not being allowed to be out, but also, you could be thrown in jail and et cetera. So I think that I tend to be hesitant to psychologize kind of social moments or in that way, but I do think that is kind of instructive. And then it also explains some of the continued divisions of for whom is this, because we know right now, like, trans people are being continued to be deprived many of those kind of basic needs, even while others can move on to live their best life.
Yeah, without continuing to hold up Maslow's hierarchy of needs is like the true correct way that the world works. Safety comes before belonging on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so if you're thinking about the debates that are happening about police in the Pride Parade, for people who see the presence of uniformed police officers as a threat to their safety, Maslow, let's just bring him into the conversation, would say that those safety needs need to be met before the connection needs of belonging to a community need to be met. All right. Well, I have a BA in psychology, so I'll let that be the last word.
Do you really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
You learn something new every day, not just listeners, but fellow co-hosts. With that, listeners, if you have thoughts on Pride Parade and who gets to be in it, come chat with us on Facebook or Twitter at PastPresentPod. Now into our closing segment, What's Making History? Natalia, what is making history for you this week?
Well, I'm keeping on the Pride Month theme because it's a whole damn month, people. So, listen up. But this is from a listener suggestion. Joe Schmidt, who is like really the head designer of history curriculum for the New York City Department of Education, sent me this really interesting article from Chalkbeat. New York City schools integrate LGBTQ stories in social studies curriculum. And it's a story about how, as the headline says, New York City schools are beginning or are now definitely teaching LGBTQ history as part of social studies, as part of history, not as a separate elective. And most relevantly for what's making history, not as a controversial subject matter. Like, as we talk right now, critical race theory is trending on Twitter. It's been I think is one of the opponents to it says recodified to make everything which is talking about race or white supremacy or racism be perceived as noxious and not appropriate to discuss in the classroom. Meanwhile, while that rages, here in New York City, this LGBTQ curriculum has been rather quietly adopted into the schools. Granted, this happened a few months ago when most people were focused on remote learning rather than kind of curricular classroom wars, because there was, and by the way, for most high school students still is, no actual classroom to go to. So that's kind of maybe part of it. But I do think it's really interesting that as there is so much so much controversy over like so-called identity politics being shoved down the throats of American children, that this issue, which for so many years was like one of the primary issues that conservative parents were worried about, their kids being recruited to be homosexuals, learning about perverse lifestyles, the undermining of the family. This is like no big deal. And you might say, well, it's New York City. There are fights about critical race theory all over New York City that are happening. And so to me, that's super interesting. And there's the Chalkbeat article brings this up too, but our history of education listeners will also remember that New York City had a very big controversy over a curriculum, which was an LGBTQ education curriculum in 1992 called Children of the Rainbow. And there were major protests about that. Interestingly, many of them from people of color who were recent immigrants or very religious people who thought that it was inappropriate to talk about homosexuality in schools. New York City is certainly no less a diverse place than in 1992, but the fire over this particular issue in this particular place in this particular moment does not seem to be that intense. And that, people, I would say, is a good thing. So yeah. And I should say, just like sidebar, I do find it interesting that we are having this major classroom war over curriculum in this moment when like so many kids don't even go to school. Like, I think that the outrage should be that they're like not learning anything. You think they're being indoctrinated? Good luck teaching anything over Zoom, much less like indoctrinating like some white child to hate himself or race war. I mean, it's ridiculous to me. On the other hand, it makes sense because actually whatever is being done is on Zoom and parents can see, right? And so you're seeing, if you follow like education controversy Twitter, why don't I just call it Classroom Wars Twitter? You see that there's constantly these like clips from Zoom of school board meetings or teachers, etc., theoretically perpetrating these great crimes against their children. But I would say, dude, chill out. No one's learning anything on Zoom, much less being indoctrinated by whatever ideology you find noxious. Open the schools. That's it.
I love that the takeaway is that they're focusing on the wrong thing. It's almost as if the complaints about critical race theory et al. Are not really about the classroom so much as they are about other things.
Yeah,
exactly
for sure. And
right.
I think to the extent that LGBTQ history and LGBTQ representation has become non-controversial, I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but I do think that we can think about sort of the larger public acceptance of the gay movement, of the gay community, vis-a-vis, the ongoing fraught history of American racism is, in a lot of ways, it's sort of clarifying there, or at least it puts a certain spotlight on that particular history, I think, from the vantage point of thinking about, again, Americans' rapidly shifting ideas and attitudes about homosexuality and queer persons in this country.
I think that's right. We should say, to your point about tempering this, there are only 4 states that have such curriculum required. So let's not go too far. And I also think it's relevant. This is in social studies, not sex ed. So there's like a different kind of conversation that happens when it's talking about like the mechanics of sex that might not be as intensely received or isn't as when this is like part of like the evolution of our country and it's talked about as a kind of sociocultural identity.
Yeah, we can talk about this again when it shows up in Alabama school board debates, but that's going to be another 100 years from now, so we probably won't be around for that fight.
Yeah.
All right, Neil, what is making history for you?
Well, for the last couple of years, my body has been slowly falling apart. I don't know if that's a...
Welcome to aging.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. I don't know if it's a reflection, just a fact of aging or a fact of sitting at my computer all the time or the convergence of both. I had this experience 2 years ago where I went to see a physical therapist about what I thought was tennis elbow. I thought I'd injured my elbow picking something up in the house. And what we found out over several months of therapy was that it wasn't an elbow injury. It actually was all originating from my neck and my shoulder. And this was because of the way I was bending myself over my computer all day. And basically every bad thing that we are experiencing in our bodies these days is because of our desktops.
You had laptop elbow.
Yeah, a laptop, neck, shoulder, elbow, the whole thing. My physical therapist, by the way, said at the time that we should only sit in front of our computers for 30 minutes and then get up for 10-minute breaks.
LOL.
LOL, yes, to that. I say all of that not just to be, grandpa telling you about my ailments, although, side note, I'll be starting a separate podcast titled exactly that soon, but to serve as a background for this amazing article in Vice that I wanted to share called How the Personal Computer Broke the Human Body. It's written by Lane Nooney, who I think is a media studies professor at NYU. And basically, it's looking at how the rise of computers have radically transformed our body and become the thing that has given our bodies so much pain. I just want to read this one passage. Decades before Zoom fatigue broke our spirits, the so-called computer revolution brought with it a world of pain previously unknown to humankind. And then she goes on to say, our bodies quite literally were never meant to work this way. And it's such a fascinating history. She looks at some computing magazines in the 1970s and how they started receiving letters from computer users who were complaining about vision and like eye pain that they were having, and how that was sort of the origin of conversations about how computers were giving bodies new experiences. And so it begins with like lots of complaints about vision, lots of complaints about eye pain. And then it begins in the 80s and the 90s, particularly as more and more people are working on computers and begin to have computers in their home, complaints about their arms, their wrists, all the things that I've mentioned about myself. And there's so many fascinating things happening in this article. I really urge you to read it because I'm not going to be able to get to all of it. But one of the really smart points she makes is that the history of computing has been so focused on the inventors and the sort of innovative technology stories of this history, right? It's all about like coders and inventors and innovators. And she says if we think about computing pain, that totally changes the history we're telling. It takes the history of computing outside of the hardware and puts it in our bodies. And that's a place in which all of us experience this history, right? If we tell a history of computing that's only about, the couple of innovators, the couple of inventors in Silicon Valley, that makes the history of computing that has like very few actors. But if we think about the history of computing and the ways in which it shows up in all of our bodies, basically all of us are part of that story. And I thought that was such a smart point. And the other thing she mentions is that this has been an issue that has been felt very unevenly and unequally. So it has fallen especially hard on women and women of color because they tend to be overrepresented in clerical professions that have required them to be bound to their computers in the ways in which like white collar professionals don't have to stay at their desk all day. And so there's a terrific history in which she talks about the ways in which the computing industry and also corporate culture thought about what it meant for the clerical staff to be complaining all the time about the pain that was showing up in their bodies because of this unbroken 9 to 5 experience with the computer, and also how this ties into the rise of things like ergonomics and physical therapy and how all of those remedies to this issue were really individualized, right? It was up to you to go to physical therapy. It was up to you to order the ergonomic chair from the office supply. It was up to you to figure out if you needed an adjustable keyboard and whatever other built solutions to this experience were. So I'm only touching on a couple of brilliant things this piece raises, so I really urge you to go read this, and also urging all of us to maybe step away from the computer a little bit more often throughout our days. So again, we'll link to the article, but it's by Lane Nooney, and it's called How the Personal Computer Broke the Human Body.
It's a good post-pandemic goal to sit at the computer just a little less often, I feel. I feel like now is the time. Seize the day.
That is, yeah, it's so interesting for so many reasons. One, it's kind of like, you know, the desk diseases of the 19th century were like totally a white collar affliction, right? And now we see that like everything is unequal. Even once you get, you know, poorer people working at desks, they're experiencing those afflictions worse than people who have more control over their time. But I also think that earlier point is so fascinating about what happens when you start looking not at like the innovator or the creator, but at the impact on people's bodies. I mean, imagine like, I think that has happened a little bit with, say, like, you know, the rise of like McDonald's, right? We think of that primarily in terms of like the rise of the fast food industry. Right. But I think like sugar is the first thing that comes to mind there. Like all of these titans of Coca-Cola, I know your favorite, Neil, but you know, of these kind of like really successful businesses. Yeah. Oh, right. I heard that's super healthy and organic. I think that's a really interesting way of like reframing our understanding of historical legacy.
I just want to say this is a non-diet soda shaming podcast. So just we'll add that disclaimer.
I like it too.
Well, what is making history for me this week are the Pentagon Papers. By the time you listen to this, we will be at, June 15th? And June 15th is the day that the Nixon administration shut down the publication of the Pentagon Papers by the New York Times in the first case of prior censorship by the government. So censorship before something was published since the Civil War. So this was a pretty big issue. The Pentagon Papers, for those of you who aren't familiar, are the secret study of the Vietnam War that was ordered by the Department of Defense and the Pentagon to give a true accounting of how the federal government had approached the war, what it had known, when it had known it, and in doing so detailed all of the lies that successive administrations had told to the American people and even to Congress in official testimony. So these were explosive papers. They were classified and so not meant for publication, but they were leaked to the press by Daniel Ellsberg, who was lied to by the New York Times about how they were handling the Pentagon Papers. There's a really fascinating story that came out about that in the mid-2000s. But the thing that I want to focus on today, you're going to be able to read a lot about the Pentagon Papers because it's the 50th anniversary of their publication. But the thing that I want to zero in on is this oral history of the Pentagon Papers the New York Times did. And in particular, one telling detail that was pulled out by Sui Liwi, who is a reporter for the New York Times, part of the account of Linda Amster. Linda Amster was one of the women in the research department at the New York Times. It tended to be the case that women were relegated to research and copy editing at the Times during this period, although they were elsewhere in the paper as well, but there were not that many women. And Amster tells about being pulled out of the research room, taken over to the Hilton Hotel, where the New York Times had set up this whole team of people to Xerox the papers, go through them, begin to prepare them for publication. And several women were assigned to help with this project. Amster was one of them. Betsy Wade was the copy editor on it. Linda Charlton, who wrote biographies for all of the key figures in the papers. When the first installment comes out on June 13th, Linda Amster looks at the newspaper and they run the names of the core team that worked on the Pentagon Papers, the editors, the reporters, but it doesn't have her name. And it doesn't have the name of any of the women who worked on the Pentagon Papers. And so she goes to one of her bosses and she's like, where's my name? Why isn't it on here? And he tells her, well, you're a woman. And we were afraid that we might have to go to prison for publishing these classified documents. And so we didn't include your name to protect the women of the New York Times.
Wow.
So chivalrous.
Right? She was furious. She remains furious to this day. Everyone who was working on the Pentagon Papers for the New York Times knew what the stakes were. They knew what the risks were. They knew they could go to jail for doing this. They ultimately don't. The Supreme Court, by the end of June 1971, will hand down a ruling that says that the Nixon administration doesn't have or hasn't demonstrated that that there's enough of a national security risk to prevent the publication of these documents, which by that point had also started to be published by the Washington Post as well. But I thought this was just a fascinating detail about the erasure of the women who worked on the Pentagon Papers and this account of the reason for why they were taken off of the byline for this major moment in journalistic history is so interesting. You should read the entire oral history. It's really, really fascinating. And take advantage of all of these lookbacks that are being done about the Pentagon Papers. I just wrote one for CNN this week that looks at the classification regime, leak investigations, and the pledge by the Biden administration not to prosecute or go after reporters in order to reveal their sources in leak investigations. And that is a very small step towards righting some of the wrongs that have been done about leaks like these. Anyway, check it out. It is the oral history of the Pentagon Papers at the New York Times.
Yeah, I have that open in a tab. It looks so interesting. My less intellectual contribution to the Pentagon Papers media. Do you guys remember when I did that paid commercial for the Meryl Streep movie called The Paper,
yes.
where I was a historian on the street for Lifetime or A&E, and I was interviewing people what would you have done if you were Katharine Graham? Would you have published that? It was kind of funny.
It was your Billy Eichner moment.
Yeah. Right. It is kind of fun to interview people
on the street.
I've never done that before. I think I would like to do that again. Listen, people, that was have you guys ever done that? Just gone up to people in the street and interviewed them? It's really fun.
No, I never speak to strangers.
I was about to say, as something of an introvert, that makes me die inside a little. So,
to each her own.
glad there are people like you and Billy Eichner in the world, though. All right, well, that will do it for this episode of Past Present. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. You
can help us out by heading right over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a rating, which helps other people find us. You can also become a patron of Past Present through Patreon at patreon.com/pastpresentpodcast. Head on over to pastpresentpodcast.com to find show notes and sign up for our newsletter. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at PastPresentPod. You can also tweet with each of us individually. Neil is at NeilJYoung17. Natalia is at Natalia Petrozella. That's Natalia Petrzela. And you can follow me at Past Punditry. And with that, this show is history. See you next week.